So this is how we kind of explain series versus parallel flow. So this is typically something that is a bit hard to understand at first. So series, if you know what series mean, it basically means one thing after the other, after the other, after the other, whereas parallel means kind of several things happening at once, right? Series versus parallel. And so the entire cardiovascular circulation is happening in series flow. And what that means is blood has to leave the lungs. It must go to the heart. It doesn't have a choice. It must go to the body. It doesn't have a choice. It must go back to the heart. It must go back to the lungs. And we can describe this as series because blood must go to all four of these spots: lungs to heart to body to back to heart and to lungs. Parallel flow is different because here blood has a choice. And so we said parallel flow exists in the lungs and then in the systemic circulation. So in the lungs, blood can decide some of it is going to go to the left lung, some of it is going to go to the right lung. And so we can have two different things happening at once, and we describe that as being parallel flow. Likewise, in the systemic circulation, all blood doesn't go to the liver, all blood doesn't go to the kidneys, but rather some of the blood can go to the liver, some of the blood can go to the kidneys, some of the blood will go to your bladder, your upper extremities, lower extremities, et cetera, and that is all happening at the same time. So we describe that as being parallel flow. So a really good example is the fact that the kidneys get about 20% of our cardiac output. So it doesn't get all, but it gets some of that percentage. So basically, we have the liver being oxygenated simultaneously, the kidneys are being oxygenated, the other parts of the body, all happening at once. And so we can describe this as being parallel flow. So basically, in parallel flow, blood has a choice as to where it goes. In series flow, blood does not have a choice. It has to go to the heart, all of it. It has to go to the body, all of it. It has to go back to the heart, again, all of it. And then all of it has to go back to the lungs, okay? I hope that made sense because this is often a topic that's kind of confused. What's the difference between series and parallel flow? All right, so I'll pause here and see if there are any questions. Okay, so let's keep going here. So the cardiovascular system, again, is a closed system. We've got flow through the systemic and pulmonary circuits in series, meaning that all of that has to happen. It must go through both the pulmonary and the systemic circuit and then back to the heart. Whereas the parallel flow, blood kind of has a choice. It's going to flow, independent of what's happening in the other organs. So blood is leaving the left side of the heart. It's going into our arteries. It can make a choice as going to the brain. Some of it goes to the brain, some of it goes to the heart, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's going to go to the right side of the heart. Once again, in the lungs, some of it can go to the right lung, some of it can go to the left lung. And so here we see that there is an option as to where blood can go. All of the blood does not have to go to the liver. All of the blood does not have to go to the upper extremities, et cetera, et cetera. Let's speak about the coronary circulation. So the coronary circulation is also a part of the parallel flow. So blood is divided as soon as it gets out of the aorta. The first branches of the aorta are called the coronary vessels, and this is how the heart supplies itself with oxygen. So the heart is kind of selfish in this way, and I always make this analogy because it takes the very first bit of blood from the base of the very first artery, which is the aorta. So this is the aorta, and coming out the base of the aorta, we've got two main arteries, the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery, and this is why we describe the coronary circulation as being parallel, because all of the blood does not go to the coronary circulation. Rather, some of the blood goes to the coronary circulation, and then some of the blood can go into the right coronary artery, and some of the blood can go into the left coronary artery. So these are two kind of parallel events happening at the same time. So contrary to what we may want to believe, blood in the chambers of the heart does not actually supply the heart muscle, the cardiac cells itself with blood. But there are vessels that are running on the outside of the heart that supplies the supplies the heart with oxygen and nutrients. And these are called the coronary arteries. So the heart has its own capillaries, it has its own vessels. We're not going to talk about the exact branching. We'll talk about this when we look at the cardiovascular anatomy and the cardiovascular, in the anatomy lab for the cardiovascular system, which will be in the next semester. But I want you to understand here that the heart has these vessels that are on the outside of the heart, and they supply the heart with oxygen and nutrients, and they remove carbon dioxide from the heart muscle itself. So blood that supplies the heart is not taken from the blood that's sitting in the chambers, but rather it's taken from these tiny vessels and capillaries that are running on the surface of the heart, called the coronary circulation or the coronary vasculature. And the two main branches of those coronary vessels are the right coronary artery, supplying the right side of the heart, and the left coronary artery supplying the left side of the heart, and they come off of the base of the aorta. Let's talk about where the heart is located. So it's located in the central thoracic cavity. It's going to be bordered on either side by the lungs. So we got the right lung and the left lung. It's also going to be bordered by the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is sitting beneath the heart. Here we go, this muscle here. And it's basically separating the thoracic cavity up here from the abdominal cavity down here. The heart is typically the size of a fist, so it's going to kind of correlate to the size of that person and the size of their fist usually. But we can see instances of what we call cardiomegaly, which is where the heart is really large. That can either be just congenital, either you're born that way, or that can be some type of pathology like high blood pressure. Sustained hypertension can make the heart be really large if those muscles are working really hard. But typically, under normal circumstances, your heart is usually about the size of your fist. And it weighs about 250 to 350 grams, so kind of moderate in weight and size. So it is a hollow organ when it's empty, meaning that it's just basically these four openings, and then the ventricles are going to have a bit of a thicker muscle. Specifically, the left ventricle will have a bit of a thicker muscle. It's surrounded by the pericardium. So the pericardium is this serous membrane. And when I say serous, it's a really thin, really tiny membrane that wraps around the heart. And it's made up of two smaller membranes. So we'll talk about that later on. But basically, it forms this membranous sac in which the heart sits. And there's a very tiny amount of fluid that's located inside the layers of that pericardium. And that is what produces the lubrication to prevent or decrease any friction as the heart pumps blood around the heart, around the body. So remember, the heart is moving, it's pumping blood. And so we have the movement of this pericardium. And so that tiny bit of fluid that's located within the layers of the pericardium is what kind of provides the lubrication as the heart moves and prevents sticking or friction that may otherwise be experienced if we didn't have that small amount of fluid. Now, looking more closely at the layout or the makeup of the heart, we've got three layers: the epicardium, which is the outermost external membrane of the heart; the myocardium, which is pretty much the meaty or muscular part of the heart. This is made of the cardiovascular muscle or cardiac muscle. And then the innermost layer is actually an endothelial layer called the endothelium, and it's pretty much an epithelial lining that is inside the heart. So the heart is made of these three layers: the epicardium, the myocardium, which is the thickest part of the heart. It's really all of this muscle that we see here made of that cardiac muscle. And then the inner lining is called the endothelium. And that is pretty much an epithelial layer, which is a thin layer of cells inside the heart. Here we can see the comparison between the wall of the right ventricle, which is much thinner, and the wall of the left ventricle, which is substantially thicker. And this is a theme that we will continue to see. The left ventricle is much thicker because of the resistance against which the left side of the heart has to work. So remember, the left side of the heart is pumping blood from the left ventricle out into the systemic circulation. And so because the systemic circulation has much more resistance, one, but it also is a longer distance, right? A greater distance out to think about moving blood to the very tips of your fingers and very tips of your toes. It's a much greater distance. And so the left side of the heart has a harder task pumping blood out to that systemic circulation. The right side of the heart only pumps blood out to the pulmonary circulation. And so it's a shorter distance with much less resistance. And so we're going to see that the right side of the heart has much less work in comparison to the left side of the heart. Another correlation here is hypertension. So if someone has sustained hypertension, which is basically high blood pressure, their left cardiac muscle is working against even more resistance, right? Even higher pressure. And so we can see the left side of the heart in persons with sustained hypertension becoming even thicker than the normal thickness of the left ventricular wall. So the pressure within the chambers is what drives the cardiac cycle. And this is a really important connection to make here. So blood is not being pumped actively throughout the heart. Rather, we've got these pressure gradients that is facilitating the movement of blood. So blood moves from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. And so the normal direction of blood is going to be from the atria, which are the filling chambers, into the ventricles, which are the exiting or pumping chambers. And so from the ventricles, it's then going to move out into the arteries that are leaving the heart. So what keeps blood moving in that unidirectional fashion? What keeps blood moving in one direction is one, the pressure gradient, but also the valves. So the valves are preventing any backflow of blood from where it is into the previous chamber, for example. So blood cannot move from the ventricle back into the atria. That's impossible. So the valves are helping to keep blood moving in one direction. They're also opening passively based upon these pressure gradients. So when the pressure in the atria is higher than the pressure in the ventricle, the AV valve will open. Likewise, when the pressure in the ventricle is higher than the pressure in the aorta, the aortic valve will open. So these valves are not kind of opening actively, they're basically opening as a result of the pressure gradient that is driving blood from one area to the other. So let's talk about these valves here. So we've got the right AV valve, which is called the tricuspid valve. This separates the right atrium, and I'll kind of point them out here. So this is the right AV valve, separating the right atrium from the right ventricle. We've got the left AV valve on the left side of the heart, separating the left atrium from the left ventricle. This is called the bicuspid valve, sometimes also called the mitral valve because it's shaped like the mitre, which is the bishop's hat. If you've ever seen that, or if you've seen that the bishop in chess, it's kind of shaped that way, that chess player, that chess, you guys get it, that chess piece is what I'm trying to say. That is called the bishop. It's shaped like a mitre's hat as well, the bishop's hat. And we also call it the bicuspid valve because it has two cusps, whereas the tricuspid valve on the right side has three cusps or three leaflets. We can also speak about the papillary muscles and the chorda tendineae. These are two structures that are located in the ventricles themselves. So the papillary muscles are these muscles that are sticking up here. And then the chorda tendineae are these tendinous cords or fibrous connections to the valve itself. And so what these two structures do is prevent the valve from going back up into the atria. It kind of anchors the valve to the floor of the ventricle. So when the ventricle begins to contract, the valve does not prolapse back into the atria, but it is connected to these tendinous cords that we call the chorda tendineae, and they are connected to the papillary muscles that anchor the valves down and prevent it from going back into the atria. The semilunar valves are going to be the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve. So these are located between the ventricles and the vessel that's exiting, the arteries here. So the aortic valve separates the left ventricle from the aorta. And here it goes. And the pulmonary valve separates the right ventricle from the pulmonary artery. Okay, and remember, although this is shown here in blue, this is still an artery. It's taking blood away from the heart, and that is the true description of an artery, a vessel that takes blood away from the heart, whereas the true description for a vein is a vessel that brings blood back towards the heart. So not so much whether it's carrying oxygenated or deoxygenated, but more specifically, its direction of flow in relation to the heart. And here we can see the action of the semilunar valves. So when the ventricle is contracting, the semilunar valves are open and squeezing blood out into that artery. When the ventricle is relaxing, the semilunar valves are closed, but the AV valves are open and filling up blood into that ventricle. All right, and that is all that we're going to look at for this first unit, the anatomy of the heart. Make sure you have a good understanding of the anatomy. It's really going to be important as we move on to talk about the function, the electrical activity, and so on and so on. And I like to refer to this little schematic here, this little video clip it here, because it's showing you exactly what's happening in all parts of the heart at the same time. So we're going to speak about the right heart and the left heart, but it's really important to have a big picture understanding of what's happening in all parts of the heart simultaneously. Alrighty? Okay, so I will see you guys next Wednesday. Have a good weekend, and remember there will not be any class on Monday, but stay tuned for that recording. As well as the practical. I'll probably try to put everything in one announcement just so I don't bombard you with emails on Sunday evening or Monday morning. All right, take care. Bye-bye.